Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Amanda Jayatissa, author of the debut novel, My Sweet Girl. Amanda, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, if someone hasn't yet heard about your debut novel, My Sweet Girl, how would you describe the novel?
Great question. It's about a woman who finds her blackmailing roommate dead in their San Francisco apartment, and she is convinced that his death is tied into some of the incidents that took place back when she was living in Sri Lanka and the decisions that she made when she was leaving the orphanage when she grew up. It combines a lot of my favorite elements of, suspense and mystery. And there's also a few hints of a ghost story in there. So I've been told it's a little creepy, which I kind of take as a compliment. So, yep.
That's great. Well, do you remember the original idea or impetus that led you to write My Sweet Girl?
Yeah, it's been, I think it was a very long and windy road that got me here. And it's actually a very funny story. So I was working on another book, which wasn't going well, right? I was having this absolutely horrible case of writer's block, the kind where you're screaming into your pillow at night and shaking your fists at the heavens, wondering why it's not coming together. And I was just, I think, in a bad mood in general because of this. And then I had a very unfortunate encounter with my bank where, I was supposed to have signed some paperwork and I swore I did and they swore I hadn't. And I had this really annoying morning trying to sort that out. And, one of those situations where you're very frustrated, but you still feel like you have to smile through the whole thing and be polite and your jaw's aching at the end of the day from, that fake smile you have going on. And afterwards, I did what I think many writers in my position would do. I escaped away to my favorite coffee shop, ordered the largest cup of coffee that I could find. And after, I was caffeinated and coffee makes everything better, I pulled out a notebook and a pen and I started to sort of rage write, where I was writing all these things that I found really annoying, and it was very ungracious and not the most polite things that I was saying. And I was just letting this poor bank teller have it. I was just writing down these horrid things. And after a while, I was like, okay, hey, I'm actually having a really good time writing in this voice. Right? I was giving myself permission sort of to be really, really mean, which I don't think I had ever done before because, we are sort of raised in this ideal, you should always be polite, you should always be well-mannered. And I just dropped all of that. And, I thought, hey, what if I write a main character who was like this, who was thinking all these things in her head? Of course, she was presenting a different face to the rest of the world. And that's when sort of this Paloma character was born. That's my main character. And then I took the previous story that I was working on, and it had this certain plot twist, big reveal elements. And I ripped that story apart, took out only the bits that I really liked and I thought were working. Started narrating it in this character's voice, and suddenly everything seemed to click. And I was having a really fun time writing it. And I think that's always a good sign where that something's working, is when you're starting to really enjoy it rather than really kind of wade through it, in that annoying way. And that's where the idea came from.
Wow. Well, you've said that your novel is partly my experiences of living in the U.S. and being a brown woman navigating typically white spaces, and partly an ode to the horror stories you whispered as a child growing up in Sri Lanka. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the first part, my experiences of being a brown woman, I think that was something that I felt was sort of missing a little bit in the genre. I read very heavily in the suspense, mystery, thriller genre. Of course, I'm a big lover of it. And I found that a lot of the main characters shared a very similar experience. And most of them were white, sort of white women in their 30s. And that was all, it's all great and it's all very interesting, of course. It's just not very similar to the experiences that I had. Um, you know, things like microaggressions, things that I faced when I was living in the US. Of course, we didn't have that term at the time, right? Microaggressions. It's something
Sure.
that's very new. And certain things that I think people said that at the time I was laughing off, but it didn't sit right with me. And I tried not to make too much of a big deal about it, because I think as brown women, that's something that you're sort of taught at a very young age, is try not to make a big deal about things, right? Laugh things off and be this model minority. I didn't find these elements in too many of the books that I was reading. So it wasn't something that I did particularly consciously, I think, at the
Hmm.
time. I was just writing as a woman who was annoyed at a number of things. And it just so happened that the things that I was annoyed about were these experiences that I had that I didn't even realize was annoying at the time, if that makes sense, sort of. It's just that when I started digging deeper into this is when I realized I was like, okay, so someone said that to me and that was perhaps not okay, even though at the time I did laugh about it because I didn't
Sure.
really understand that situation too much, but it never sat right with me, you know? So that was, yeah, there was a lot of that. I don't want to go into too many instances because I feel there might be spoilers, but
Sure.
a
Sure.
lot of the, little situations where, you feel like you're exoticized. There's a lot of, oh, where are you from? Oh, Sri Lanka and India, that's really the same thing, isn't it? A lot of comments like that were things that I had faced myself when I lived in the Bay Area. And you also asked about the ghost stories. So that's my favorite, absolute favorite part of the book. The girls in the orphanage tell this ghost story very often of this woman named Mohini. And which is, your very, I think, quintessential woman in white that we see in many, many cultures across the world. But Mohini is Sri Lanka's woman in white. And she's probably our most famous ghost story or urban legend. I think you'd be hard
Hmm.
pressed to find someone in Sri Lanka who either hasn't seen or knows someone directly who has allegedly seen Mohini, especially when traveling alone in the night somewhere, woman in white. And we used to tell this story often. And I even dressed up as her once to scare my cousins when I was about 8 or 9. So she was definitely my favorite sort of ghost, or maybe it was my favorite ghost story. And when My Sweet Girl, when that called for this sort of story that the girls would say that I wanted to base around, I tried to come up with something um, kind of on my own, but it wasn't working. And I was, and I really wanted to include Mohini because I think she played such a big part in my love of ghost stories or telling ghost stories, especially when I was younger.
That's great. I'm curious, what is it about thriller and suspense fiction that appeals to you as both a writer and a reader?
Oh, good question. I think that's a big question. I think for me, having a certain mystery element or something to solve um, is something that I think was just deeply ingrained to me from the very first sort of books that I started reading. I grew up in Sri Lanka, and the books that were very, very popular here around the time that I was growing up, especially, were Enid Blyton books. So I grew up reading a lot of, Famous Five and Secret Seven, books like that had this element of, hey, you have to solve something. Someone's playing detective and you have to solve something. And the very first, and I say this in like inverted commas, it's like the very first book that I tried to write back when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old was sort of, again, a mystery because I've always loved them. And I think as I grew up, obviously, I read widely in a lot of
Sure.
different genres, but I always kept coming back to these books that had these elements of having something to solve. And that's what engaged me. Um, of course, I've always, like I said, I've always loved a good ghost story. I've loved something with creepy elements into it. So that always, I found myself naturally reading those books or picking those books up. So it's no surprise to me or anyone that knows me really that those elements found themselves in my writing as well.
Sure. Well, what was your writing process when you were working on this novel? I mean, you talked about kind of rage writing and then taking that narrative voice and going back to your novel, but I'm wondering, um, did you do a lot of outlining? Did you just kind of dive into the narrative? What was the writing kind of nuts and bolts like for you?
Sure. My process is very, how do I put it? Um, it turns me into a very antisocial hermit is what it does because usually sort of step one is my big idea and that can come at any point in time. But I'm usually a person who, when I get this idea, I'll do that initial burst and I'll write down whatever I can, try and grasp at. And then I'd like to sit with this idea for just a little while. I have in my little office room that I've set up, I have a couch and everyone makes fun of me. I call it my thinking couch. But my husband really, he's just like, that's just your napping couch. Like, who are you? Who are you trying to kid? He'll come in and I'll be taking a nap and he's like, thinking, are we? I'm like, yes, I swear I'm thinking. So I do spend a few weeks perhaps just like sitting with the idea, letting it develop. At this time, I might write things in the main character's voice. I love to write in first person. For me, that's what feels authentic most of the time. So I spend a lot of time, like maybe writing things that never make their way into the actual manuscript, but writing things in the main character's voice and trying to really get a sense of who is telling this story and what is the story they're trying to tell. Then I do an outline. It's usually more like a beat sheet, like this needs to happen, that needs to happen, this needs to happen at this point. So I have a rough idea of where things are going.
Hmm.
It's a 50-50 of whether that gets followed or not. There have been plenty of times where I have, outlined things and it's just gotten chucked out the window. But I just like to think I have an idea of where the story is going. And then when I start writing, I actually write quite fast and I don't do much else when I'm writing that first draft, just because I like to get it all down and I like to get it all down as soon as I can. So usually a few months, by about 2 or 3 months, I think I should have a sense of what the first draft would be. And then the hard work begins, right? Where I'm ripping it apart, adding things, revising, having, obviously my husband usually reads it first and he is very, very, let's say honest. Yeah. He rips it apart. He rips me apart completely. He'd be like, no, that doesn't make sense. So why would they say that? And so thereafter, a lot of very heated discussions, I'll have something that I would then perhaps most likely send to my agent first who reads and gives me feedback. And we take it from there.
That's great. Well, what writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories and novels?
Oh, I think very, very importantly, not to compare yourself or your process to anybody else. I think something that really, really messed me up in the very early stages of my writing was listening to other writers and getting very intimidated by the fact that, they're churning out manuscripts at such a rate or, they're making these connections. And, I am not someone that's very sociable or likes to say, put myself out there and network too much. And
Sure.
they're out there doing that. And so for me, it was very intimidating. Like, oh, should I be doing that? Am I missing these opportunities because I'm not doing that? Or, they're writing, 3,000 words a day and I can only, manage 500. Like, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? So there was a lot of comparing going on and it just took a while for me to be a little more confident in my process and then who I am as a writer and the stories, of course, that I'm trying to tell and just be like, okay, that's great. And I'm very happy for them. And of course, a lot of writers have very valuable advice if you would sit and speak to them. But it was an eye-opening sort of situation for me to be able to say, okay, I'm going to take these bits of advice, but I'm not going to take these bits of advice because while it's good advice, it's not advice that applies to me. So kind of honing my own system that worked for me.
Sure. Well, are you working on a new novel now?
Well, the next book is done actually, and will be coming out in September again of 2022, and I am super, super, super excited for it. It again takes place this time completely in Sri Lanka, most of it in Sri Lanka, and it centers around a big Sri Lankan wedding. So, and of course, someone winds up dead because, what's a wedding without a little bit of murder, right?
Exactly.
So that's the next book.
That's great. Do you have a title?
It's called You're Invited.
Great. Well, what novels or nonfiction books have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Nonfiction, I read Beautiful Country. It was an autobiographical novel written by Jin Julie Wang about her experiences of being an undocumented child growing up in America. And I thought it was amazing. Her story was amazing. So it was very interesting, of course, to me. I grew up in Sri Lanka, speaking English as a second language, like everyone in Sri Lanka does. So I think it really resonated with me, this path of sort of learning, I think especially to speak English, and this love of books and how that helps language, and then how that eventually shapes you as a person. It was a fantastic read.
That's great. Well, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your debut novel, My Sweet Girl?
It's very easy, actually. All my social media handles and my website, everything is just my name. So it's Amanda Jayatissa on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And my website's amandajayatissa.com.
That's great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Amanda Jayatissa, author of the debut novel, My Sweet Girl. The novel is on sale now, so go buy a copy at your local independent bookstore. And Amanda, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Jeff. I had such a lovely time.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Now, stay tuned for a brief excerpt from the audiobook of My Sweet Girl by Amanda Jayatissa, read by Deepa Samuel, available from PRH Audio, wherever audiobooks are sold.
The shadows from the torch Maya held under her chin made her smile look evil, like the devil mask hung in the assembly hall to ward off the evil eye. We were all too excited to sleep, so Maya called all the girls to her bunk to tell us ghost stories. I didn't really want to listen. I'm too old to believe in ghosts. But I didn't want to be the only one in bed when everyone else was all the way on the other side of the dormitory. Lihini grabbed my hand and squeezed it. I gave it a squeeze back. She loved ghost stories, which I didn't really understand. Why would anyone want to be afraid on purpose? Relax, Paloma, she mouthed. I usually got annoyed when people told me to relax, like saying the words was enough to make me forget what was upsetting me in the first place. As though ghosts and demons would just go away if we simply relaxed. But Lihini was my best friend. I could never get angry with her. I scooted a little closer to her on the floor. There was no such thing as ghosts. It just made me feel safe to be near her. Maya needed to hurry up. If we got caught out of our beds, we would definitely be scolded, maybe even punished. They might even cancel the visit tomorrow. I took a deep breath and shook my head. They would never do that. We hadn't gotten many visitors to the orphanage in a few months now. Tomorrow was important. Everyone told us so. Our headmaster, Pereira sir, Miss Chandra, even Miss Sarah, our English teacher. We were to be on our best behavior and make sure we knew exactly what we were supposed to do or say. Miss Chandra supervised the rehearsal today. Everything had to be perfect, and we were so excited that none of us could sleep. Of course, Maya would decide this was the best time to make it all about her. Sometimes I wondered if she even wanted to be adopted. She needed to be more responsible than this. She was 12 now, same as me. It's not like we were little children anymore. She walks slowly. Her feet are bare and dirty and covered in scratches. She wears a long white dress. Maya purposely made her voice into a throaty whisper so every one of us leaned forward, barely breathing. I knew this story. Vana Mohini, or Mohini as we call it. We've all heard it 1,000,000 times. We've all told it 1,000,000 times. But I still held tight to Maya's words. There's blood under her nails, and they are long and sharp like talons. She made a sudden clawing motion, and Lihini leaped back, her hands over her mouth. We all giggled nervously. And her long black hair hangs over her face like this. The torch flickered as Maya messed her hair over her face so just her eyes glinted through in the dim yellow light. Mohini walks only in the night, revealing herself to people who are all by themselves. Help me! Help me! She begs. Maya made her voice high and raspy now, like when the chalk slips when you're writing on a blackboard. Some people say Mohini's eyes are red as blood, and when you look into them, you can see straight into hell. And if you stop to help her, she smiles. And before you know it, Maya dropped the torch and lunged forward, wrapping her hands around Lihini's throat. Lihini couldn't help it this time. Her small scream rang like an alarm through the dormitory. I pulled Lihini away from Maya and put my arms around her. If I could have slapped Maya, I definitely would, but there wasn't time. Hayo, quickly, everyone, to bed before we get caught, I hissed, getting Lihini to her feet and pushing her into her bunk. Thankfully, the other girls followed.